It's good to see everybody. Hope you've had a wonderful week. Welcome to the new year. And I'm looking forward to 2021.
That's right.
I think it's going to be an awesome year.
Yep.
What do you think?
I think so. I feel kind of guilty because I actually kind of like 2020 getting to come back to Tennessee and to be
Just because you get to hang out with me.
Because I get to hang out with you. That's the main thing.
Well, we're glad that you're joining us again this evening. Again, we hope that you've had a wonderful weekend, and we're looking forward to 2021 and all that is going to come this year. So I think it's going to be a wonderful year and an exciting year. Joshua chapter 9, that is where we are continuing our study. Now, if you remember back in Joshua chapter 8, they defeated Ai. And the reason they defeated Ai was because they went to who first?
God first.
They went to God first. And after they defeated Ai, who did they remember?
They remembered God.
They remembered God. Okay? And how easy and how quickly we forget.
Yep.
All right? That's kind of what goes through my mind, is how easy, how quickly things turn on for us as humans. And we leave God out of things.
Yep.
Or maybe we forget things.
That's right.
And that's kind of what we're going to see here in chapter 9 with Gibeon. Right? So why don't you go ahead and why don't you read, let's read 1 through 1 and 2.
As soon as all the kings who were beyond the Jordan in the hill country and in the lowland, all through the coast of the great sea toward Lebanon, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, the Jebusites heard of this, they gathered together as one to fight against Joshua and Israel.
Okay, I did that on purpose.
I noticed you gave me the names.
I did that on purpose. I gave you the names. No, but what do we see taking place here? We see that all of these particular cities are coming together to do what?
To unite to fight against Israel.
Right.
Or at least to defend themselves.
Right, to defend themselves against Israel. So it's evident they have heard what's going on. They've seen what's taking place at Jericho. They've seen what has taken place at Ai.
Right.
And so now they're coming together to fight against Israel. And so they're making preparations. And then there's Gibeon. And Gibeon does something a little different, don't they?
Yeah.
They don't get together with other cities to fight against Joshua and the Israelites. They do something completely different.
That's right.
So let's begin there in verse 3. But when the inhabitants of Gibeon heard what Joshua had done to Jericho and to Ai, they on their part acted with cunning and made ready provisions and took worn out sacks for their donkeys and wineskins, worn out and torn and mended, with worn out patched sandals on their feet and worn out clothes. And all their provisions were dry and crumbly. And they went to Joshua in the camp of Gilgal and said to him and to the men of Israel, "We have come from a distant country, so now make a covenant with us." Okay, so the folks from Gibeon kind of do a different strategy. We're not going to fight. Let's do something else.
Yep.
Right? Let's go and let's talk with Joshua and let's try to make a covenant with him. But what did they do? What was so unique? What did the Gibeonites do when they approached Joshua and those guys? What do you think?
Well, it says they acted with cunning.
Okay.
So they're devising this plan of how can we, when we approach them, how can we get them to feel sorry for us? Instead of wanting to defeat us, how can we get them to want them to help us instead? So they come up with this plan to make themselves look like they're poor and they're weary wanderers and that type of thing.
Now, I'm wondering if there is some knowledge here from these folks, if they truly understood Joshua and the Israelites. Because if you remember, if you go back and look at Exodus 34, if you look at Deuteronomy 7, you look at Deuteronomy 20, Moses is telling the people, or actually God is telling the people, that they are not to make a covenant with whom? Do you remember?
The people of the land.
The people of the land. unless they are from a far
foreign land.
off. And so...
And Gibeon is actually 5 miles away from AI, just right down the road.
Right, Gibeon is...
They're the next in line.
They're
probably.
the next in line, and I think they see that. So I'm wondering if the folks at Gibeon had some knowledge of this somehow or another. And so when it says that they are cunning, not only are they making themselves look like maybe they're poor or weak or whatever, but it makes it look like that they're from a long distance. And we kind of see that come out in the next couple of verses, right?
Right.
All right, so let's begin there in verse 7, if you will, and let's go down to verse 11.
Okay. But the men of Israel said to the Hivites, perhaps you live among us, and how can we make a covenant with you? They said to Joshua, we are your servants. Joshua said to them, who are you and where do you come from? They said to him, from a very distant country your servants have come, because of the name of the Lord your God, for we have heard a report of him and all that he did in Egypt, and all that he did to the 2 kings of the Amorites who were beyond the Jordan, to Sihon the king of Heshbon, and to Og king of Bashan, who lived in Ashtaroth. So our elders and all the inhabitants of our country said to us, take provisions in your hand for the journey, and go meet them and say to them, we are your servants. Come now, make a covenant with us.
Okay. So, again, kind of going back to the theory I've got in my mind, is they've done their research.
Right.
They have figured out some things here about the Israelites and possibly about the covenant that God had made with them, especially about how to deal with the people when they come into the land of promise.
Right.
So, if you were, I guess, a leader of Gibeon, and you heard about Joshua and the Israelites, you've seen what they've done to Jericho, you've seen what they've done to Ai, what would you do to save your family?
Yeah. And you know, we've seen more than once in the book of Joshua it talking about how that the hearts of the people in Canaan had melted because of what they had heard about from Israel. So it's kind of that fight or flight mentality. You know, you've got the 5 kings earlier that we're going to, who usually fought each other, but now we're going to come together to fight, and it's more of a flight kind of mentality with them. It's self-preservation. We're going to do what we think we need to do, and that's what and that's basically what has led them to this point of we're scared. We can't do nothing. If we do nothing, we're going up like Jericho and Ai. So,
I agree. And so they are doing a really good job in pleading their case here.
Right.
So
they keep saying your servants, your servant.
Right. I guess the smoke and mirrors here would be, I guess, the best way to describe this. They're 5 miles down the road, but when they meet Joshua and the men, they look like they've come from a long distance. Yeah. And the story continues. So let's pick up here in verse 12. Again, the Gibeonites making their case. Okay? So, verse 12, here is our bread. It was still warm when we took it from our houses as our food for the journey on the day we set out to come to you. But now, behold, it is dry and crumbly. These wineskins were new when we filled them, and behold, they have burst. And these garments and sandals of ours are worn out from the very long journey. So the men took some of their provisions, but did not ask counsel from the Lord. And Joshua made peace with them and made a covenant with them to let them live, and the leaders of the congregation swore to them. Okay, so again, the Gibeonites make the case, and I guess Joshua and the leaders swallow it hook, line, and sinker.
Yeah. They didn't name what country they were from, so Joshua says, how do we know you're not from here? Give us proof. Well, here's the proof, and they're lying, of course, but as you said, that deception that they had put on the back clothes, they had the old bread that they said was still warm from the oven when we packed it. So here's the evidence, and then okay.
So what's going through my mind is this: we see them defeat Jericho because they sought counsel with God. We saw them go attack Ai for the first time. They lose big time because they did not seek counsel with God.
Right.
Then we see them go back to Ai and this time defeat Ai because they sought counsel with God. And then at the end of chapter 8, we see them sit down. They're in, the valley and the mountains, and they're on both sides, and they're praising God and making this covenant, and they're truly invested in God. Okay? And here we go. We're approached by these men. They make this sob story, and we see what happens.
And verse 14 is the key there.
Right. Read that again for us.
But they did not ask counsel from the Lord.
Okay. So, we saw what we're supposed to do at Jericho. We saw what we're not supposed to do at Ai, and then we saw what we're supposed to do at Ai. So you would think that they would continue to do, again, just making the covenant again, and then, the next chapter over, how quickly we forget.
Yeah.
And so we see them.
And Joshua should have known better.
Hello.
He was the one that had the conversation with God about, why in the world did you let this happen to? And God says, I didn't do it to you. You did it to yourself because you didn't seek my face, know. And then Joshua is here, how quick. But again, we do the same thing. We forget God and leave Him out of our plans. And as quickly as you think we should have learned our lesson, we turn right around and make the same mistakes far too often again.
Right. And I think that's what I love about Scripture, is because we can continue to go to Scripture and we see some of the things that we do, we see that people do in Scripture.
That's right. And it's one of the evidences of Scripture in that the heroes of faith are not made out to be perfect. We see good, bad, and ugly, and with some of them there's lots of ugly involved. But
all right, so let's continue on. So what happens? All right, so Joshua has this conversation with them, and he decides to make a covenant with them. So let's begin there in verse 16. And man, I'm just really hammering you today.
You're a fan.
I want you to read 16 through 18. I'll give you all the great words again.
I appreciate it. At the end of 3 days after they made a covenant with them, they heard that they were their neighbors and that they lived among them. Dun, dun, dun. And the people of Israel set out and reached their cities on the 3rd day. Now their cities were Gibeon, Chephra, Beeroth, and Kirath Jearim. But the people of Israel did not attack them because the leaders of the congregation had sworn to them by the Lord, the God of Israel, and all the congregation murmured against the leaders.
Okay, so what's going on? So what's going on is Joshua and these men have made a covenant with these folks. And then they find out what? They find out that the Gibeonites live just right down the road.
Right. Only took 3 days to figure that out.
Right, only 3 days. And so I think...
And don't you imagine Joshua? Oh, here we go again.
Yeah, but part of this is Joshua's fault, is it not?
Yeah.
Because he did not seek counsel.
And the people call him on in this.
Correct. Time. The people call him on this, and I think that's what we see. What there in verse 17?
17 and 18.
The congregation murmured against the leaders. So I think maybe what's going on here is once the Israelites realize that the city of Gibeon is just 5 miles down the road, these verses from Exodus 34, from Deuteronomy 7, from Deuteronomy 20 start coming back into their mind. When God tells them, when you get ready to go into the land of promise, you are going to completely annihilate these cities. And if you don't, then there will be, I guess, consequences.
Right.
And we're going to see that here in just a few minutes, but I think that's what's going on there in verse 17. When they begin to murmur, they realized, wait a minute, these folks just live right down the road. These people are not from afar off. And so we've just went against the covenant that God has made us. So what's getting ready to happen to us?
And more specifically, they saw it with, after they came out of Jericho with Achan and his family. And now they're wanting to say, hey, I didn't do it this time. It was the leaders. I'm not part of that. You focus on them, Lord, because we didn't make that covenant. It was Joshua and the elders that did. So they don't want to be brought down like Achan
Right,
was.
they don't. And so you got all these folks murmuring and just talking, trying to figure out what's going on. And so what do they got to do? Well, you made a covenant, so now you've got to deal with that. Okay, so let's begin there in verse 19. But all the leaders said to all the congregation, we have sworn to them by the Lord, the God of Israel, and now we may not touch them. So again, the leaders are saying, well, although we did something wrong, we made a covenant, and we have to stand beside the covenant. And so verse 20, this we will do to them. Let them live, lest wrath be upon us because of the oath that we swore to them. And the leaders said to them, let them live. So they became cutters of wood and drawers of water for all the congregation, just as the leaders had said of them. Okay, so basically the leader said, well, we made a covenant. We shouldn't have made the covenant without seeking God, but we made the covenant. But now we have to stick to the covenant. And if we don't stick to that covenant, then God will probably come after us because we didn't stick to the covenant.
That's right.
So,
and it seems like they wanted to kill the Gibeonites at that point.
Right.
Because he had to tell them, let's let them live, because we've made this vow. And, elsewhere in Scripture, we're told that if you make a vow to God, you're better off not to make a vow than to make a vow to God and not keep it. And that covenant, I don't know that we sometimes get, it's not just a promise, it's not just a contract, it's even more this covenant relationship that they had. When you make a covenant with someone, you got to keep the covenant. When you make a covenant with God, you've got to keep the covenant. That's why it's so important for us today, the covenant that we enter into with our spouse. It's not we're just making promises. We'll say that sometimes, but it goes deeper and beyond that. The seriousness of the relationship and connection that you're putting you're hooking the horses up together in a team, and it's got to be that way from then on.
Right. So now Joshua, I feel like he's trying to back up a little bit, and he's trying to figure out what do I do now? What do we do now? And so we see him begin to kind of, I think, try to figure some things out. So let's go to verse 22. So Joshua summoned them, and he said to them, why did you deceive us, saying, we are very far from you when you dwell among us? Now therefore you are cursed, and some of you shall never be anything but servants, cutters of wood, and drawers of water for the house of my God. And they answered Joshua, because it was told to you, your servants for a certainty that the Lord your God had commanded his servants Moses to give you all the land and to destroy all the inhabitants of the land from before you. So we feared greatly for our lives because of you and did this thing. And now behold, we are in your hand. Whatever seems good and right in your sight, do to us, do it. So Joshua's trying to figure out what's going on. Why did you guys lie to us? And again, it kind of goes back to my conspiracy theory earlier of the Gibeons. That's kind of what they're saying here. The Gibeonites are saying, we knew about the covenant that God had made with the people of Israel, that when they come into this specific land, they're to lay waste to every inhabitant there. And they're just basically telling Joshua, we're trying to save our lives.
Yeah, and Joshua kind of does like he did before with Achan. He didn't blame God this time, but he blames the Gibeonites. Why did you deceive us? Well, Joshua, why were you deceived? It wasn't because of the Gibeonites. It was because you didn't seek counsel from the Lord.
Right. He should have immediately went to God in prayer. And that's what we talked about in chapter 8, was it not?
Yeah.
We should immediately went to God in prayer when these people approached to seek the counsel of God, to see what needed to be done here with these people.
Yep.
And so now the Gibeonites are pretty much saying, okay, we're at your mercy now, so you do what you feel like is right. And of course, again, the thought here is, well, Joshua, you made the covenant with him now, and so now you're going to have to deal with that. So why don't you read 26 and 27?
So he did this to them and delivered them out of the hand of the people of Israel, and they did not kill them. But Joshua made them that day cutters of wood and drawers of water for the congregation and for the altar of the Lord to this day in the place that he should choose.
Okay. So, what ends up happening to the Gibeonites? They end up becoming servants for how long?
To this day that this book was written.
Till this day. And this even goes further. If you wanted to go to 2 Samuel 21, let's just read there. 2 Samuel 21, beginning in verse 1. David ends up dealing with the Gibeonites because of this right here. There was a famine in the days of David for 3 years, year after year, and David sought the face of the Lord, and the Lord said, there is a blood guilt on Saul and on his house because he put the Gibeonites to death. So Saul went against the covenant that was made by Joshua.
Right.
And so now David is having to deal with this issue that Saul did, but Saul's dealing with an issue because of Joshua.
Right.
And
he talks about even there in 2 Samuel 21 about that covenant that was made all the way back then, and that's why it's a problem.
Right. And so, again, I think it just goes back to what we talked about last week when we were in chapter 8, of making sure that when we have decisions to make, no matter what it is, big or small, we seek God's counsel.
Right.
We seek God's counsel for any things that are going on in our lives. If Joshua would have just stopped for a minute after these folks approached him, and I get it. I could see Joshua looking at these people and having pity on these men that approach him. You know, they look rough. They look pitiful. And so I have compassion on them. But if he just would have stopped and took the time and sought counsel with God, this might have been different.
That's right.
You know, so now the Gibeonites are slaves, servants to the Israelites, but now the Israelites have to continue to deal with these folks forever. So I think there's a lot of things that we can learn. Any thoughts you have here?
No, and you know, it's going to set up the next chapter too about, you know, how, because they're in that covenant they're your slaves, and you look at it like, well, that means they're going to take care of our needs for water and firewood and all that, but there's a responsibility that they have toward them that they're going to have to fulfill when we get to the next chapter. So,
well, it's just more people to tend to.
That's right.
It's more people to take care of. It's more problems to deal with.
Yeah.
And I think they probably didn't think about that.
Yep.
At all. And again, maybe not understanding why God wanted them to come in and just totally annihilate stuff, but when you have to take care of these people, I mean, you're already taking care of so many people.
Right.
With the Israelites, and now you just picked up a bunch more people.
And I think there's a great kind of leadership and followers lessons in this chapter too, because you've got leadership made a bad call, you know, and that's going to happen with us as well. It doesn't mean that they're bad people. It doesn't mean that, you know, ministers, elders, deacons, you know, we're humans too, and sometimes make bad decisions, bad calls, and the people called them out on it. And sometimes we need to be called out for bad decisions. But then ultimately, whenever Joshua owns up to the mistake that was made, here's the solution for it. The people, you know, you see at the end of chapter 9 there, even though they wanted to kill them, you get to the end of chapter 9 and they're willing to not, they're following through with, here's what Joshua says, that's what we're going to do. And we need to be that as well, good times and bad. We need to stick behind our elders, our shepherds. 2020 was certainly, that was the case. Lots of, not that there were bad decisions made, I don't mean that, but I just mean it was hard decisions to be made.
And we're not out of a lot of that stuff yet.
That's right.
And of course, there'll still be some more adjustments and some more decisions to be made. And and I think that's one thing we just got to remember is nobody's perfect.
No. And the murmuring and complaining that they did added nothing to the solution.
Right.
It's one thing to call out and say, hey, this is a mistake. Murmuring, talking among yourselves about what's going on. That gossiping and backbiting kind of idea, that doesn't help or add to the
It doesn't
situation.
help. It definitely doesn't help. It really ends up causing more
That's it, right.
problems. Even the leaders. You think about the anxiety that these men were dealing with when they started hearing the people.
Yeah.
And the stress that put on them.
That's
so
right.
just so many different things that we could talk about and spend a whole lot more time on this. But we want to invite you to come back to services Wednesday night at 6:30 and be a part of our our Wednesday night, Sunday. I'll get it right here in a minute.
Yeah.
Come back on Wednesday night
I'm
at
not going to murmur
6:30.
and complain. I'm behind you.
And come to our Bible classes that we have on Wednesday night. And then, of course, we would love for you to come back and worship with us next Sunday at 9 a.m. It's recording. Jump in here. All right, how do we look?
Rather dashing.
Rather dashing.